It all started when I met Daniel. I was in my early 40s, having spent most of my life building a career I was proud of. But when Daniel came into my life, everything changed. He was charming, in his late 30s, and full of ambition. We met in Chicago, where I had lived for years, and after a whirlwind romance, we got married. It seemed like a perfect match, two driven people ready to take on the world together. After we married, Daniel and I moved to a suburban area just outside Chicago, close to his parents' house. Daniel was determined to take over his father's business, a family-owned company that had been in the family for generations. To support him, I made the difficult decision to leave my full-time job and work part-time. I wanted to be there for him, to help him succeed. But as soon as I did, things began to change. Daniel's sister, Emma, lived nearby. She was around my age, in her early 40s, and had always been a career-driven woman. She remained single, preferring her independence over the commitments of marriage and family. At first, I admired Emma. She seemed so confident and successful, everything I had once aspired to be. But as time went on, I realized that admiration was one-sided. Emma made it clear that she didn't approve of me. She often belittled me, making snide remarks about my decision to work part-time. "Taking it easy, are we?" she would say with a smirk, as if I was some kind of slacker relying on her brother to support me. It didn't help that Daniel never stood up for me. Whenever Emma made those comments, he would either stay silent or laugh it off, deepening the pit in my stomach. Despite my efforts to get along with her, Emma always found a way to interfere in our lives. She would drop by unannounced, criticize my cooking, and invade my privacy. More than once, I found her rummaging through my things, pretending she was just curious. It made me feel small, unwelcome, and eventually, I started to avoid her altogether. But avoiding Emma didn't solve the problem. If anything, it made things worse. She took my distance as a sign of weakness, something she could exploit. And Daniel? He just let it happen. He never defended me, never asked Emma to stop. It felt like I was fighting a battle on my own, and the person who was supposed to be on my side was nowhere to be found. Things took a darker turn after Ethan was born. Our son was a blessing, the light of my life. But his arrival seemed to bring out the worst in Emma. She would criticize every aspect of my parenting, from how I fed him to how I dressed him. "He cries too much," she would say, glaring at me as if Ethan's tears were a reflection of my failures as a mother. And Daniel, once again, did nothing to stop her. As the months passed, I started to feel more and more isolated. Daniel's indifference, combined with Emma's hostility, made me question everything. Was this the life I had signed up for? Was this the marriage I had envisioned? The thought of divorce crossed my mind more than once, but I couldn't bring myself to go through with it. I didn't want Ethan to grow up in a broken home, the way I had after my parents separated. So I stayed, hoping things would get better, but deep down I knew they wouldn't. Ethan was a special child. Even at a young age, he had an uncanny ability to sense things that others couldn't. I remember one day when he was just 3 years old, he told me that Daniel was going to hurt himself. I brushed it off as childish talk, but that very day, Daniel slipped on the stairs and sprained his ankle. It was a minor injury, but it shook me. How had Ethan known? After that incident, Ethan's predictions became more frequent. He would tell me things that seemed impossible to know, yet they always turned out to be true. It was both fascinating and terrifying. Daniel and Emma, however, found it unsettling. They began to distance themselves from Ethan, whispering that he was creepy. It hurt to see my own son treated like that, but I couldn't deny that his abilities were real. One night, everything changed. Ethan woke me up in the middle of the night, his little voice trembling with fear. "Mom, we need to leave." "Now," he said, his eyes wide with terror. He insisted that we had to get out of the house, that something bad was going to happen. I didn't understand it, but there was something in his voice, something that made me listen. I woke Daniel, but he brushed it off, saying Ethan was just having a bad dream. But I couldn't ignore the urgency in my son's voice. So, I made the decision. I gathered Ethan and our father-in-law, who was staying with us that night, and we left the house. We had no idea what was happening, but as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan had just saved our lives. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare that was about to unfold. As we drove through the dark streets, my heart pounded in my chest. The fear in Ethan's eyes had been so real, so intense. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, but he was silent now, staring out the window as if waiting for something to happen. My father-in-law, John, was sitting next to me, confusion etched on his face. "Grace, what's going on?" he finally asked, his voice shaky. Why did we leave the house in the middle of the night? I didn't know how to explain it. How could I tell him that our 5-year-old son had insisted we leave without knowing the reason myself? But I had to try. "Ethan," he said, "we had to go." I began, struggling to find the right words. He's always had this ability to sense things. I don't know how, but he knew something bad was going to happen. John was silent for a moment, processing what I'd just said. He had always been a practical man, not the type to believe in anything supernatural. But he trusted me, and more importantly, he trusted Ethan. After all, he had witnessed the little incidents over the years, the way Ethan's predictions had come true. "Where are we going?" John asked, his tone more serious now. "To my mother's house," I replied. "It's the only place I could think of. We can stay there until we figure out what's happening." We drove in silence for the next hour, the streets eerily empty at this time of night. My mother lived on the other side of town, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. It felt like the safest place to be, far from the tension that had been building in our own home. When we arrived, I quickly explained the situation to my mother, who was understandably concerned, but didn't press for too many details. She could see the fear in my eyes and knew better than to ask too many questions right then. She ushered us inside, and I tucked Ethan into bed, hoping he could get some sleep. But I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. What could have happened if we had stayed at the house? Why had Ethan been so certain that we needed to leave? And where was Daniel? The last I had seen of him, he was still in bed, dismissing Ethan's warnings as a nightmare. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. It was a neighbor from back home. Her voice was frantic, almost hysterical. "Grace, are you all right? Have you heard?" she asked, her words tumbling out so quickly that I could barely understand her. "Heard what?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Your house that's gone. Burned to the ground last night. They say it was a gas leak or something, but oh my God, Grace, where are you?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. My house, our home, was gone. It didn't make any sense. Everything had seemed fine when we left. But now it was gone. The weight of what could have happened if we hadn't left, if Ethan hadn't warned us, hit me like a ton of bricks. "We're okay," I finally managed to say. "We're at my mother's house." After hanging up, I sank into a chair, my hands shaking. Ethan had been right. Something terrible had happened, and we had narrowly escaped it. But as the initial shock wore off, a new fear began to creep in. What if it wasn't just a coincidence? What if someone had done this on purpose? I thought of Daniel and Emma. They had been acting strangely lately, more secretive, more distant. Daniel had been spending more time at his father's company, or at least that's what he told me. But there was something in his behavior that made me uneasy, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then there was Emma. Her hostility towards me had only grown over the years, and recently, She had been asking odd questions about our finances, about the house. At the time, I thought she was just being nosy, but now I wasn't so sure. I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that house. Not now, not ever. I had to protect Ethan, to keep him safe from whatever was going on. But first, I needed to find out what had really happened. That evening, I decided to drive by the house, just to see it with my own eyes. I left Ethan with my mother, not wanting him to see the devastation. John insisted on coming with me, his face grim as we drove in silence. When we arrived, the sight that greeted us was worse than I had imagined. Our once beautiful home was reduced to a smoldering pile of rubble. Fire trucks and police cars were still parked outside, and yellow caution tape surrounded the property. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I stared at what remained of our life. As we stood there, trying to process the scene, I saw them. Daniel and Emma. They were standing off to the side, talking to a police officer. My first instinct was to run over to Daniel, to demand answers, but something stopped me. Instead, I watched them from a distance unnoticed. That's when I saw it. The way they were talking, their body language, something was off. They weren't shocked or devastated like I was. They seemed calm, almost relieved. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized that whatever had happened here, they were involved. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Their strange behavior, the way they had been treating Ethan, even the way Daniel had dismissed Ethan's warning. They knew. They had planned this. But why? And how much worse could things get? I knew I had to get away from there, to get back to Ethan and figure out what to do next. But as I turned to leave, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks, Daniel's voice, speaking in a hushed tone. Emma, it's done. With any luck, Grace and Ethan are gone for good. We can finally move on with our lives. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized what I was hearing. They had wanted us dead. This wasn't just about the house. It was about something far more sinister. And now I knew the truth. The people I had trusted most were the ones who wanted to destroy me. But I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not now, not ever. I drove back to my mother's house in a daze, the weight of what I had just overheard pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Daniel and Emma had wanted Ethan and me gone, dead. The realization hit me hard, a sickening mix of fear and betrayal swirling in my stomach. The people I had once considered family, the ones I had trusted, had plotted to kill us. As soon as I walked through the door, my mother could see the turmoil in my eyes. She ushered Ethan out of the room, distracting him with a game, while I collapsed onto the couch, trying to steady my breath. "Mom, they did it," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Daniel and Emma, they wanted us dead." I overheard them at the house. My mother's face paled, and for a moment, she looked as though she might faint. "Grace, are you sure? This is unbelievable." I nodded, the shock still fresh. I heard them. They were talking to the police like nothing was wrong, like it was all part of some plan. They're involved in the fire. They thought Ethan and I were inside. The horror of what I was saying began to sink in for both of us. This wasn't just a house fire. This was an attempt on our lives. And I had no doubt that it was all part of a larger scheme, one that involved the family business, the inheritance, everything. They wanted to eliminate us to secure their future. But why now? Why had they become so desperate? That's when I remembered Rachel. Daniel's behavior had been off for months, and I had long suspected he was having an affair, but I hadn't wanted to believe it. I had seen the signs, the late nights, the unexplained absences, but I had been too afraid to confront him. Now, it all made sense. Daniel was involved with someone else, and Emma was helping him get rid of us, so they could start a new life with Rachel. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to act, and quickly, before they realized we were still alive. But I needed proof, something that would hold up in court, something that would ensure Daniel and Emma paid for what they had done. My thoughts raced as I pieced together a plan. I would gather evidence of Daniel's affair, starting with the texts and emails I had glimpsed on his phone. I'd also record any further conversations I could catch between him and Emma. I knew it would be risky, but I had to try. For Ethan's sake, I couldn't let them get away with this. But before I could move forward, I had to keep Ethan safe. My mother and I agreed that it was best to keep him out of the house while I dealt with this. We decided that my mother would take Ethan to stay with a relative out of town, somewhere Daniel and Emma wouldn't think to look. As I hugged Ethan goodbye, my heart ached with the fear of what was to come. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew I had to protect my son, no matter the cost. And so, I sent him away, praying that I would have the strength to face the storm that was about to descend on us. With Ethan safely out of harm's way, I returned home to face the nightmare that had become my life. My first step was to gather the evidence I needed to expose Daniel and Emma for who they truly were. I knew this was dangerous. I had to be careful, methodical. I started by accessing Daniel's phone while he was asleep. His carelessness worked in my favor. He hadn't bothered to lock it. What I found confirmed all my suspicions. There were dozens of messages between Daniel and Rachel, full of affection and plans for the future, plans that involved erasing Ethan and me from their lives. Worse still, there were exchanges with Emma discussing the fire, coded but clear enough to show they had orchestrated the whole thing. My hands shook as I took screenshots of everything, saving them to my own phone and a hidden cloud drive. This was the proof I needed, but I wasn't finished yet. The next day, I set up a recording device in the living room, hidden in plain sight. I knew Emma was coming over to discuss the tragedy with Daniel. I needed to catch them in their own words. As I pretended to leave for an errand, I saw Emma arrive, a fake concern plastered on her face. I waited outside, close enough to hear them but far enough to avoid suspicion. Their conversation was everything I expected and more. Emma was already talking about how to move forward with the insurance money, and Daniel was discussing how to keep Rachel in the shadows until things settled down. The cold, calculated way they spoke about us, like we were just obstacles to be removed, sent chills down my spine. But it was also the confirmation I needed. Once they finished, I retrieved the recorder, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. That night, I called John, my father-in-law, and told him everything. He was devastated, first, by the loss of the house, and now by the realization that his own children had betrayed him. But he didn't hesitate to stand by me. Together, we decided it was time to go to the police. We handed over everything, the recordings, the messages, every piece of evidence I had collected. The officers listened, their expressions growing darker as the truth unfolded. Within days, the police moved in. Daniel and Emma were arrested on charges of attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. The look of shock on Daniel's face as they took him away was something I'll never forget. He had underestimated me, thinking I was too weak to fight back. Emma, too, tried to maintain her cold composure, but as the reality of her situation sank in, her mask cracked. The court proceedings were grueling, but in the end, justice was served. Both Daniel and Emma were convicted and sentenced to prison. As I watched them being led away in handcuffs, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. These were people I had once loved, but their greed and envy had destroyed everything. With them gone, I filed for divorce, gaining full custody of Ethan. The judge granted me a substantial alimony and child support, recognizing the years I had dedicated to supporting Daniel. He was ordered to pay me $15,000 in alimony and $500 per month in child support. While the money would help secure our future, it wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the principle. It was the acknowledgement that Ethan and I had been wronged, and now we could move forward without looking back. John, who had been so hurt by his children's actions, became a rock of support for Ethan and me. He vowed to protect us, to ensure that Ethan would one day take over the family business, free from the toxic influence of his father and aunt. As for me, I finally found peace. Our lives are quieter now, simpler, but filled with genuine love and safety. Ethan is thriving, his mysterious abilities no longer something to fear but something that saved our lives. I still wonder sometimes how things could have gone so wrong, but I've learned to trust my instincts and to never again let someone else's greed dictate my life. And so we move forward, stronger and more united than ever. The nightmare is behind us, and a brighter future lies ahead.